Picture this. Milan, the autumn of 1978. A woman in her late 20s stands inside a leather goods workshop that smells of tanned hide and machine oil. And she is, by every visible sign, miserable. Her name is Miuccia Prada. She has a doctorate track mind, a political science degree from the University of Milan, and a membership card in the Italian Communist Party, folded somewhere in her belongings. She has spent years studying mime at the Teatro Piccolo, learning of all things how to communicate without words, how a single gesture can carry an entire idea. And now she has just inherited a small, fading luxury house, founded by her grandfather, a place that sells expensive luggage to a shrinking circle of old money customers. She does not want it. She finds the whole business of selling beautiful objects to rich people faintly embarrassing. She has marched in the streets for the working class, and here she is, heir to a shop that makes status symbols out of crocodile skin. And here is the strange part, the part almost nobody thinks about when they walk past that triangular logo in an airport. This reluctant heir, this intellectual who found fashion almost shameful, would go on to build one of the most powerful and influential empires the industry has ever seen, not by embracing what fashion called beautiful, by rejecting it, by selling people, again and again, the exact things they had been trained to dislike, until disliking them became the highest possible form of taste. That is the thread we are going to follow. Because there is one rule Miuccia Prada applied over and over, across 40 years and billions of dollars, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Call it the one non-obvious rule. She made desire out of rejection. She trusted discomfort over consensus. She looked at whatever the entire industry agreed was correct, elegant, expensive looking, and then she walked, deliberately, in the opposite direction. And the world followed her there and paid a fortune for the privilege. But to understand how a woman who didn't want to sell handbags reinvented what a handbag could even mean, you have to go back further, back before the empire, back to a young woman who genuinely believed her life was going to be about ideas, not objects. She was born in 1949 into the family that owned Bertelli Prada, Prada Brothers, a Milan institution since 1913. Her grandfather Mario had built it into a name that supplied the Italian royal household. By rights, she should have grown up dreaming of taking it over. She did the opposite. She buried herself in books. She earned her degree in political science. She spent 5 years training in theater and mime, which sounds like a detour but was actually the foundation of everything. Because mime teaches you that meaning is constructed, that a gesture means whatever you can make an audience believe it means. Value, in other words, is not in the thing. It is in the story wrapped around the thing. Hold on to that idea. It is the whole game. In those same years, she was politically active, left-wing, skeptical of luxury, and the whole apparatus of consumer desire. People who knew her then describe a woman wrestling with an obvious contradiction. How does a committed leftist inherit a luxury house? Her answer, eventually, was not to resolve the contradiction but to weaponize it. If she had to be in fashion, she would be in it as a critic from the inside. She would make fashion that questioned fashion, and that intellectual discomfort, that refusal to simply make pretty things, turned out to be the most valuable asset she had. When she took over in the late 70s, Prada was stagnant. Leather luggage was not exactly the cutting edge of anything. And then the first great reversal happened. And it happened because of a fabric nobody in luxury would have touched, Pocono nylon, a tough, industrial parachute and tent material that the company had used quietly, decades earlier, to cover steamer trunks. Cheap, practical, utterly unglamorous. The fabric of soldiers and survival gear, not of Milanese elegance. And Miuccia looked at this humble, almost ugly material and thought, yes, that. In 1984, she released a black nylon backpack, plain, unstructured, stamped with that small triangular metal logo, and almost nothing else. And here is where it gets really strange. The buyers were confused. Why would anyone pay a small fortune for a bag made of the cheapest industrial fabric on earth, when the whole point of luxury was the rare, the precious, the expensive looking? They turned it over in their hands, frowning. And then it sold out. And then it sold out again. And then it became one of the defining status objects of an entire era. Think about what she actually did there. She took a bag that cost a fraction of a leather one to produce, and priced it higher than bags made from the finest hides on earth. A bag woven from the same stuff as parachutes, costing more than calfskin. By every logic of traditional luxury, this was insane. Leather is rare and noble. Nylon is what your cheap umbrella is made of. But that was exactly the move. The nylon bag was a Trojan horse, smuggling intellect into status. It said, I am so confident, so secure, so far above the game of obvious wealth, that I don't need to signal money through expensive material. I signal something rarer. I signal knowing. And this is the heart of the one non-obvious rule. She understood that for a certain kind of customer, the educated, the urban, the people who found ostentation a little vulgar. The ultimate luxury was not looking rich. It was looking like you were too smart to care about looking rich. The nylon bag let you buy your way out of the appearance of buying your way in. Value had migrated. It no longer lived in the material. It lived in the meaning. And the meaning was, I get the joke that you don't. She did not do this alone. And the story turns dishonest if we pretend she did. In 1977, she had met Patrizio Bertelli, a fierce, combustible businessman who was, at the time, actually manufacturing leather goods under the Prada name without permission. Instead of suing him into oblivion, she partnered with him, then she married him, and the two of them formed one of the most productive creative commercial pairings in the history of the industry. She, the restless artist who never wanted to repeat herself, he, the relentless operator who built the manufacturing, the retail, the financial machine underneath her ideas. He famously pushed her, fought with her, protected the business side so she could stay difficult and uncompromising on the creative side. Every empire built on an artist's vision needs someone willing to be the villain in the boardroom. He was that. The tension between them, and it was real tension, loud and documented, was part of the engine. And if you are finding this story as strange and compelling as I did when I first fell into it, take a second right now to subscribe. Because what comes next is the moment she did something that should have been career suicide, and instead rewrote the rules of taste for a generation. Because the nylon bag was only the warm-up, the real detonation came in the mid-90s. By then Prada was successful, respected, profitable. The safe move, the move everyone in her position makes, would have been to keep producing beautiful, desirable, tasteful clothing, and let the money roll in. Instead, in 1996, she sent out a collection that the fashion world would come to call, with a mixture of horror and reverence, ugly chic. Picture that show, the front row of fashion editors and buyers, people whose entire professional identity rests on knowing what is beautiful, watching the clothes come down the runway, and not knowing how to feel. The colors were deliberately off, murky browns, sour greens, dirty yellows, the palette of 1970s kitchen linoleum and grandmother's wallpaper. The prints looked like cheap upholstery. The silhouettes were awkward on purpose. These were clothes engineered to provoke a specific reaction, a flinch, a small involuntary recoil. That's ugly. Why is that ugly? Wait, is it ugly? It was ugly, and it sold out. Now why would that work? Why would the most sophisticated buyers in the world pay top prices for clothes designed to look like a thrift store mistake? Here is the thing nobody talks about. Conventional beauty is easy. It is consensus. Everyone agrees a clean line and a flattering color are attractive, which is precisely why beauty, in fashion, is cheap. It is the lowest common denominator. Anyone can sell pretty. What Miuccia understood, with that mime-trained, theory-soaked brain of hers, was that the truly rare commodity was not beauty. It was the authority to decide what counts as beautiful in the first place. By making ugly desirable, she wasn't just selling clothes. She was performing a demonstration of power. She was proving that taste is not a fixed natural law but a thing that can be authored, and that she was one of the very few people on earth who could author it. If she said the sour green was chic, and the fashion world believed her, then she had revealed the secret machinery behind all of it. Desire is manufactured, and she was the manufacturer. The ugly was a weapon against lazy beauty, a way of saying, anyone can give you what you already like. I can make you want what you didn't. That is the rule again, in its purest form. Don't ask what everyone wants and give it to them. Ask what everyone has been taught to reject, and make it irresistible. She kept doing it. The deliberately clunky shoes, the flame-printed accessories that flirted with bad taste, the collections that quoted suburban dowdiness and made it covetable. Each time, the same psychological trick. Take the thing that triggers a flinch, recontextualize it inside the world of Prada, and let the flinch transform into desire. And each time the lesson underneath was the same. She trusted her own discomfort more than she trusted the room's consensus, because the room's consensus was, by definition, what everyone already had. The discomfort was where the unclaimed territory lay. And then there was Miu Miu. In 1993, she launched a second line, named after her own childhood nickname. And the way most people describe Miu Miu, the more affordable, younger sister brand, completely misses what it actually was. Miu Miu was not a discount Prada. It was her younger, freer self given a name. It was the place she could be even more experimental, more playful, more unresolved, less burdened by the weight of the main house. If Prada was the intellectual making careful arguments, Miu Miu was the same mind let off the leash, quicker, riskier, more openly strange. Two channels for one restless sensibility that refused to be contained by a single aesthetic. Now let's talk about the scale, because numbers make the strangeness physical. The Prada Group, built on nylon bags and ugly collections and the deliberate inversion of everything luxury was supposed to be, eventually listed publicly. In 2011, after years of delays and false starts, the company went public not in Milan or New York, but in Hong Kong, chasing the Asian market that had become central to luxury. The group came to be valued in the billions. At various points, its market value has run into the tens of billions of dollars. Sit with that. A multi-billion-dollar enterprise, built by a former communist who marched against capital, founded on the radical proposition that the cheapest fabric on earth could be worth more than the finest leather. And that ugliness, correctly framed, could outsell beauty. A bag made from the fabric of parachutes, priced above bags made from the skins of the rarest animals, and a global fortune assembled, one flinch at a time. But honesty demands we sit with the contradictions, because they are not small, and the story is cheaper if we hide them. There is the obvious one, a woman who carried a Communist Party card and believed in the dignity of the worker, presiding over a luxury house that sells objects most workers could never afford. She has never fully resolved this, and to her credit, she has never pretended to. In interviews over the years, she has been startlingly candid about her ambivalence, about finding aspects of her own industry difficult, even distasteful, about the strangeness of pouring a serious intellect into the business of clothes and bags. That self-awareness is rare, and it is real, and it is also, let's be honest, part of the brand's appeal. The discomfort sells. The intellectual who is troubled by luxury becomes a more compelling seller of luxury than someone who simply loves it, and there is a sharper tension still. Here is a feminist who came up through left-wing politics, building an empire that, like all fashion empires, ultimately trades in how women look and what they are willing to spend to look a certain way. You can read her work as a liberation, clothes that refused to flatter, that rejected the male gaze prettiness fashion usually demands, that let women dress for ideas instead of for approval. That reading has real force. Much of what she made was genuinely a rebellion against conventional sexiness. But you can also ask the harder question, whether any luxury house, however clever, can fully escape the machinery it operates inside. Both things can be true at once. A system and a person are not the same thing, and a person can push against a system from inside it without ever fully breaking free of it. The interesting move is not to pick a side but to hold both, the genuine rebellion and its genuine limits, in the same hand. There are the questions about price and exclusivity too, about who gets to define taste, and whether anti-status status is just status with better marketing and a flattering self-image attached. A skeptic could say the whole nylon bag philosophy was a brilliant way to charge leather prices for cheaper goods, while making the customer feel intellectually superior for paying them. That's not an unfair reading. It might even be partly true. But notice that it doesn't actually diminish the achievement, it describes it. The genius and the critique are the same fact seen from two angles, and someone will always say, wasn't she just lucky? Didn't she simply inherit the resources to gamble? The safety net to be weird? Wasn't ugly chic a roll of the dice that happened to land? Those are fair doubts and they deserve a fair answer. Yes, she inherited a platform. That's undeniable. And plenty of people inherit platforms and run them into the ground or keep them comfortably mediocre for decades. What she did was not preserve an inheritance. It was risk it repeatedly on ideas that looked like mistakes. And the proof that it wasn't luck is the repetition. Luck doesn't happen the same way for 40 years. The nylon bag, the ugly collection, Miu Miu, the flame shoe, and decades later the decision to bring in Raf Simons as co-creative director, sharing authorship at the height of her power, when every instinct of ego says hold on tighter. Each of these is the same move. When everyone expects one thing, do the other. Trust the discomfort. A single contrarian bet is luck. A lifetime of them is a method. Before we wrap this up, drop a comment and tell me, what's one thing the world calls ugly or wrong that you've secretly always loved? I'm genuinely curious where your own taste runs against the grain. Because here is what I keep coming back to. The temptation with a story like this is to file it under fashion and move on. But it isn't really about clothes. It's about how value gets made, anywhere, in anything. Miuccia Prada spent a career proving that the obvious, agreed upon, everybody likes it thing is almost never where the real worth lives. The real worth lives in the thing people haven't learned to want yet, and the person who can see it before the crowd does, who can stand in front of a roll of parachute nylon or a sour green dress and feel, against all consensus, this is it. That person doesn't follow the market. They author it. She took the mime's lesson and ran it across an entire empire. Meaning is constructed. A gesture means what you make people believe it means. A bag, a color, an ugly shoe. None of them have fixed value. The value is the story, and she was simply better at telling it, with objects instead of words, than almost anyone alive. So the nylon was never really about nylon. It was about the radical idea that worth is a decision, not a discovery. And the ugly was never really about ugly. It was about the authority to redraw the line that separates desirable from embarrassing. and the nerve to redraw it constantly so no one could ever catch up, which leaves us with the open question, the one I can't quite stop turning over. What does it mean that the woman who found fashion almost embarrassing, who never wanted the inheritance, who marched against the very wealth she'd come to embody, became its most powerful intellect, that the deepest skeptic of luxury built one of its great empires, not in spite of her skepticism but because of it? Maybe the lesson is that the most powerful person in any room is the one who isn't fully seduced by it, the one who can see the machinery because they were never quite under its spell. Or maybe it's something stranger. Maybe the only way to truly master a game is to never stop being a little embarrassed to be playing it. She's still working, still, by all accounts, a little uncomfortable, still designing against the expected, and we're all still trying to catch up to a woman who, 40 years ago, looked at a parachute and saw a fortune that nobody else could see, because nobody else was willing to want what they'd been taught to reject.